Galleria Passa del Lupo, strada statale 17, Varianti Volturara. Way of the Wolf Tunnel, State Road 17, Volturara. Alternative route. Signs over tunnels and doors to slow, to stop, to warn. Lights on. Tune your dial to. If you must stop, do so now. You are entering. No turning back. No lose. You must hold your own waist inside you until you hopefully make it through.
This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective. What you've heard is Kimberly Campanello's voice reading from her most recent project, a rewriting of the Divine Comedy by 13th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri. Kimberly Campanello is a poet, writer, performer, and professor at the University of Leeds. Her poetry collection, An Interesting Detail, has recently been published with Bloomsbury Poetry, and her first novel, Use the Words You Have, is released on June 23, 2025, with Some Such editions. Her work appeared on Poetry Island Review, the Cambridge Literary Review, and the Poetry Review, and her poem Moving Nowhere Here was the most read poem in Granta in 2023. A dual Irish and American citizen, she is with us today to take us on a walk through her poetry and her transnational and transatlantic belongings. A new version of Dante's Commedia, a journey mapped or unmapped by different threads, your origins in Elkhart, Indiana, your family origins in Volturara Apula in Puglia, your experience of degenerative illness, but also voices from the outside, so counter-narratives, indigenous peoples' histories and art practices, and critical reflections on Dante. There's a whole world going on there.
Yeah, and it wasn't something I sort of set out to do, I guess. That would be wild to set out to do something like this. But it came about, I guess, last year when I was working on what could be called a memoir, but is probably more like a poeticized autofiction about my family background, which I had started writing and researching in, I guess, 2019. And I had done all the reading around that and had written up a kind of initial draft that was very boring. And, and it was really flat and straightforward. And I had been advised, the reason why I was doing it at all was because when Zaf Kunial, the poet, was hired by Leeds, we went for a drink early on, and he was like, Kimberly, you should really write something about your family's restaurant because it's just so interesting. And I was like, why would I do that? That would be so cliche. That's the most cliche thing ever. And so as a result, I kind of started thinking about researching and writing that, but not in a cliche way. So the whole thing begins with, I was born into the cliche Italian American Midwest, and then it goes from there. But as I was working on that last summer in Salento, at a residency called Ramdom, at the Cora Art Institute in Castrignano dei Greci, I arrived there not speaking any Italian, not knowing what the heck was going on, and I was just supposed to hang out in a place. And that's where I did all that work, but it's also where I was in a cafe looking up and seeing, Via Dante, which connects all the squares of all the places. And so, of course, it was almost like Dante was kind of stalking me throughout the whole experience of writing that. And then that's what led me to go down that road through a lot of chance operations, I suppose.
So the Dante story, which I remember from our meeting in Sorrento the summer that just passed. So there's Via Dante, but as far as I know, you come from French studies. So where does Dante come in?
Yeah. I had in high school, I had read Dante. I had an amazing English teacher who had us read but this was for an English class. We began with the Aeneid, then we read all of the Commedia, and we read Vita Nuova. And then we moved through time and read all the, English people influenced through that, Anglophone writing influenced through that. And so I'd read Dante a long time ago, but of course I'd always, as a Francophile, because there was no Italian in high school, and my mom is a Francophile, I love medieval French poet, the Roman de la Rose, and I loved all that stuff and the kind of strangeness of it. And yeah, I think the French angle on it is very much that sense of, I think I was thinking about the other night, because when you asked me to do this, I was thinking, gosh, this is just a really strange story. But every Friday night when I was in high school, I used to work in our restaurant and in college as well. And I would check out a movie from the library in French, and I would put one of our coupons over the subtitles. And this was like after work until midnight. And I would watch these movies in French. And it was all very pretentious, but that was kind of what my thought was, that everybody in Europe was having this amazing cultural experience and had all this understanding of history and everything. And that I was just like at the restaurant, which makes sense that I would then have difficulty linking it all up in my creative mind. But of course, it's all connected. Yeah, so the French process was something that, certainly Arthur Rimbaud and all the French poets of the 19th century were the ones who most struck me, as did, I had an amazing class, Indiana University, South Bend, when I was in high school, because I had studied abroad through Indiana University with a French family when I was 16. And when I got back, obviously I was in my high school French class, and I didn't need to be there. So they let me drive to South Bend, to Indiana University, South Bend, and take French classes. But it was with all people from Francophone countries from the continent of Africa who were studying to just become certified French teachers. So I read Tahar Ben Jaloun, I read Mariam Abba, and I loved all that, especially because the experience was with people from those contexts who, I was very literary, and they were very much trying to move into that world to be able to teach French. And then we had these amazing conversations. So try to replicate that anywhere. I don't know how that's going to work, but yeah, so that's a very long answer, but it's a long story.
So there's this journey that you're taking with Dante in your new version of the Commedia, but there's also this journey through your own history and through your own family, that is, you said, a poetic autofiction.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of ties back, because the first autofiction I wrote, which was about that experience studying in France as a 16-year-old, and it is a kind of writing through of Marguerite Duras' L'Amant and L'Amant de la Chine du Nord, but also of Une Saison en Enfer, because that's what I was reading at the time. And it's a writing through of that, through this experience of, having a kind of sexual awakening, poetic awakening, what have you. But that book is called Use the Words You Have, because the teacher said to us before we went from Indiana University, we had to have this tea with this very proper, she was French and German, one parent each. And she told all these parents who had traveled all the way from all over Indiana to Bloomington to have this tea with her. And she said, we are going to bring these people very low. But she was like directly translating it from French.
Yeah.
And she was saying, these are the top, these are the cream of the crop of the entire state. And we're going to make them small and bring them low because they're only going to be able to speak. And I remember thinking, whoa, this sounds really scary. But when we went, we literally had to sign a contract and only speak that other language. We had to speak that language with each other, which was really, really strange. But the saying was, you use the words you have to find the words you need. And, we would talk way around things because we weren't allowed to have a French-English dictionary. We could keep it at our house, but we could only use it in emergencies. And once we'd use it, we had to wait a certain number of days between using it. It was crazy. So this idea of like use the words you have is a big part of my kind of poetics, and is a big part of just how I think politically, but also how the dislocation that you feel when you're thinking in another language or speaking in another language is obviously, you know, communication wise causes problems, but it's also a really beautiful thing because that's what makes things work and not work, and evocative and not evocative. And you know, I'm thinking today I was just running around the village, and various people I was saying to them in dialect, kiana kian, like piano, which is the same as piano piano. They're like, ah, kiana kian, no, kiana kian. It's like, yes. And then it communicates on a different level.
We're talking now with you being in Volturara, and how does that feel? What does that mean to you? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that thing where it's like, boy, I wouldn't have thought this would happen. But also, of course, because as an ill person, I can't imagine a better place to sort of be ill, because I walk around and people are constantly caring for other people who are in various states. I describe the houses here in various states of care and disarray, and so are the people. And there's a kind of process for dealing with that that is, you know, not super technological. It's very much like, I don't want to say rudimentary, but it's like basic, as in like, you know, the base, the kind of root of it. And I don't think that's essentially Italian. I think it's just still happening. I describe this to people here. I'm like, each of these villages is like a hive, and bees go in and out. And they're like, they just are like, yeah, that doesn't speak to me as a metaphor. So, you know, but for me, that's what it's like, is that there's this like buzzing hive of activity, with, you know, rival queens in most contexts. But yeah, I mean, it is a very, very strange situation, and yet it's so familiar. It's the sort of thing that I think, I mean, to get on my soapbox, I suppose, that we need to do more of, is to that alienation of, you know, really thinking about what it means to move place, to change language, to think through things like immigration, which is such an issue here that's being drummed up as if it were a problem. But equally to think about the great connectivity across all the violences that exist, which I wrote a bit about in the opening that is clearly about Gaza. But you know, and the repetition of that mirrors the kind of you know, Mussolini's use of chemical weapons on Ethiopia. I talk about in that canto, it's Canto 2, Inferno 2, where I'm in the archive, the Archivio Comunale. Like, who would have thought I would go there? But you know, I say my credentials, because Inferno 2 is the part where Dante's really worried about, is he good enough? But he's not actually, he's just telling us, because it starts 3 times, the Inferno. So my credentials, I read the letters in the village archives about the dark woods, all 3 of them. In the prison, in the village archive, I read minutes and years. The minutes and years share the space with a blood bank and a snowplow and a barbecue grill. This is what it means to descend into detail. The letter K, the cross, the X on its side, for a tree, for its wood, to burn for heat, and to eat, to live. The forest named for saints, the forest name for the one who carries, the forest name for the one who finds, the third forest name for the people, together, in common. But it becomes like, what does it mean to descend into detail, to know where these things come from? And that, you know, with all the stuff that we're dealing with, is about all we can do. So yeah, I think your question was, what's that like? I think it's pretty much exactly
Like that.
I mean, today I was in somebody's cave way down underneath the house, just because people were like, do you want to come see my cave? You know, a lot of people, and they're like, did that help you with your research? And I'm like, did it help you with your research? I don't know. Because it's all part of the sense of what Victor Shklovsky calls like the estrangement of, you know, I've estranged this place to its own people by virtue of my presence. which isn't necessarily bad, but
No, yeah. The dislocation of language, is it
yeah.
a dislocation that you'd say you feel in the body, is a geographical dislocation, is a time dislocation? Because would that go back to your family history? Is a dislocation that you
Yes.
feel in a kind of genealogical
Yeah.
sense as well? Because then at the end,
That's what-
Italian is a language that you started learning a year ago. So it's a fairly
Yeah.
new experience.
Yeah, and it's an interesting experience because it's taken me back to when I was in that Francophile period where you're kind of like a baby and you're not very, you don't come off very well. And yet the appreciation is so much greater in this cultural context for any effort you make. So yeah, I think it's a good way to slow down your mind around words is to speak another language, and to also think about all the people who do that on a regular basis, who are not poets, who are not interested in language and it's part of their job. I think I can idealize it because that's my work. But so yeah, I think when it came to my great grandmother, who I knew, she's from this place, which is now a population of less than 400. She didn't really say very much, but everybody spoke to her in English except for the older generation, her kids. And I just remember her being there all the time in a really positive presence, but we don't, it's like, do you know someone when you can't deeply speak to them? But do you ever really deeply speak to those people who really care for you? Do you, that level of intimacy that we would value kind of intellectually or politically is not the same thing. And so I think that the language has a lot to do with that when you have many languages in a house or in a space. For Teresina, it wasn't like a thing that she was like, oh, I wonder about words. My dad said, I was like, well, what did she talk about? He was like, well, she didn't really talk. She just did stuff. She's always doing stuff. Yeah. And then she would be like, you do that and you do that and you stop doing that. And that was the conversation. So
that's all the words that you need. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And I will never forget what you said in Sorrento, talking about Italian, and I'm quoting you here. When I spend my day in Italian, it just doesn't hurt. And there's this kind of sense of
yeah. I mean, that makes me choke up just hearing you say that back to me, because it's very strange. It short circuits something that is it's very powerful. Chatting to people. And yeah, I mean, I think I don't think I got that when I was learning French, but of course I wasn't ill, but I was also much more concerned at that age about what people think of me, whereas now I just don't really care. And so in a way, it's perfect timing to show up here. But there's just so many ways that I mean, I talk about it in the whatever Oraga map, a pocket, a grave is about, but I take the word mapin, and we grew up saying that all the time, and which I was like, what's the etymology of that? Well, it goes back to mappa, to map, and so tracing that map and thinking about, I talk about the weaving of the cloth of the everyday, and that is what life in these contexts is like, and what life, and to a great extent, was like in Elkhart, in that small community. But of course, it's totally fragmented now. Whereas here it persists, but is shrinking. It's all, I suppose, the things that Dante was worrying about like political and social structures, about who's in charge, about what they believe, about who's in charge, about the discourses around that, and national, this idea of the national poet. But what is a nation? All those questions I think are made more obvious when you don't know what you're saying or why you're saying it with those words. Yeah, so it's been a circle.
Yeah, all this waving, there's a lot of work of care of yourself through the language, through the poetry. There's a kind of synthesis, both in what you've been saying, but also in what I've read of yours. There's a kind of synthesis of the past, but also of a futurity. And it's not about an impossibility of a future, nor a kind of forgetfulness of what it was, but your writing kind of condenses everything in an everlasting present moment. You have this wonderful image of you sweeping ants in a pile of dust that then links back to your grandmother, but then projects the reader somewhere else, but it's all in the same moment, and you condense all of yourself in this atom in time.
What I tried to do with some of the translation is try to pull us out of this. I think I say it, I alert the reader several times when I'm doing the actual translation bits, but it's not about skulking after old classics. It's about seeing through reading, and seeing through reading in all senses of that. I think I say, because this is the end of the Canto 1, but very much through me. And what I've done is I've moved it so it's like accurate, a little bit less accurate, not me adding stuff across the page. So it's not about shame at a gate or about skulking after old classics. It's about seeing through reading, whether where you are going has been or is now or will be written or not. To me, I think I'm trying to write Dante as I think he might have written if he wasn't afraid he'd be killed for doing it. Because like he definitely hints at these sorts of ideas. I mean, my favorite part of the Mass is the kind of thing where it's like seculi seculorum and all, all that sort of stuff where it's like as it was, is now, and ever shall be, world without ending. I'm like, wow, that's fabulous. Like that's that's Keats. It's so many different ideas that you don't need a kind of belief in anything for. Because you can just say it. And it happens. I love that idea. All these sorts of things present themselves to you, and then you just have to sort of roll with it, which is the way that I've been trying to work with the Commedia, is very much trying to, stuff just appears. And the main reason why I wanted to bring this up is to talk about the Potawatomi, because at the same time I was reading all the stuff about Dante at Notre Dame, I'm from that place. I had a very good Indiana history teacher in 4th grade, Mr. Myers, who made sure we had a really good understanding of the whole history of that area. And so I thought, well, this is Potawatomi land. Like, I know that. And when I was reading about Simon Pokagon, who's known as the native Longfellow, first American translator of Dante, and I was looking at his equivalent of the Incunabuli, which are printed on birch bark, and these very, very delicate pages that are the sort of origin stories of the Potawatomi. So Blair Morsau has a really brilliant book with Routledge that goes through all of these, the physical objects, but also the linguistic properties. And the discussion of the linguistic properties of these texts is so interesting because it mirrors the Italian context of dialect, of the emergent properties of differing, do you choose Latin? Do you choose this? Do you choose that? But the difference is that the way he's talked about, not by Morsau, but by, folk contemporaries of his, is that it's like, well, he couldn't really have understood Ojibwe because he's using blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And I'm like, well, do they not understand like how people live in the world, but also have they not read any other manuscripts anywhere by anyone full of errors of I'm putting quotation marks up. So then I turn the page and I read a passage where it's explained that the unit is not the tribe, the unit is the village. So that's why his language is syncretic. That's why it is the way it is. And I thought, well, that's that. But it's also why, there is a distinction between how someone like Simon Pokagon would be viewed and still be understood, and the work he did, and someone from a European background and their work and how their use of language is understood and perceived. Vast difference, because, for all the reasons we can list. And so one of my thoughts is to kind of try to bring this together, to get these threads to come together, because they're already there. So there's been a lot of academic work on that. And that's the great phrase that I love, which ties back to your point about time, which is the great kind of meanwhile, in this place, this is what's happening. And I listened to a biography of Longfellow recently, And his wife was, they were weavers. They had the big weaving factories, Fanny Longfellow and all this. And I'm just thinking, boy, they really should have thought about the meanwhile there.
Yeah.
Where's all this stuff coming from? All those questions. So I suppose I don't want to be the poet who never thought about the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my take on time. So when I intervene in Dante, so he talks about dead poetry. So it's purgatory. So I sing for a second king. I mean, this sounds exactly like colonialism, but it is actually very, very close to Dante. Raising sails, crossing over new waters, away from cruel seas. My talent never better. Leave it all behind. I sing for a second kingdom. Human spirit scrubbing up. Dead poetry rising from the flip side. I turn each line over to placeholders. Await the stream of live words. To show the extent, I'll bring in troubled birds, trying to bounce my sound back to me, which is what Dante says. And then I say, for some reason, they want a pardon. He says so. But that was before all this happened. From our end, for our part, on their behalf, for our benefit. The case is deep. In fact, it's as follows. If we finger just one thread, shore, water, trees, bird song blowing us, you, me back, as they, I, you try to land, then feathers stripped for hats, then poisons went down, softened eggs never hatched, till those were banned. Now numbers hold a thin slice of the pasts. So grief, air of death, tight chest, sweet blue, like it was once before, us. So, that's all very close Dante, but also all these other things it's me seeing through reading. It's me seeing what I want to see.
This second kingdom that you read about, and the idea of exile, self-exile,
Yeah.
Can we say you share that with, the poet who birthed the language?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, he's often writing about, I can't remember what exactly he says. He does say un regno. He was always grappling with are the kings supposed to be in charge? I mean, that was all what, who's the political leaders, who's the church leaders, who can be trusted to be a boss of somebody else, which are the persistent questions of Italy today, but also of anywhere. Equally, the assumption, like you were saying about futurity, I'm in a kind of exile from my own experience some of the time because of my illness, in the sense that I feel not fully, I suppose in some ways I feel ahead of my experience rather than behind it, which seems weird because of the slowing down, but it actually has to do with a kind of projection. And many people with Parkinson's are meant to have this big creative outburst, and there's a question about whether it has to do with the brain chemistry or just a kind of taking stock or, whatever it might be. But the exile question, I do feel like I impose that upon myself, but again, you've taken wherever you are with you the whole time and you probably don't know.
So there's that other great question of proper names of, I think you define it, the stripping of the language through poetic periphrases. And there's so many movements in there. There's in your writing, there's the I, there's the poet K, there's the you, there's the us, there's this I that becomes us. And then all the lack of proper names. I don't know what your take on the effect on the audience is, but what I perceive is always this idea that the lack of proper names is a possibility for abstraction, but also a possibility to apply a kind of framework that you present onto different scenarios. So there's a kind of blending of the reader, of you, of poet K. I mean, I'm talking about you and poet K as two separate things, but I'm not sure this is correct.
I mean, sure, it's correct in this moment, I suppose, because I'm talking to you about the poet K. But, you know, the poet K will then possibly put this podcast conversation into something, you know, because the poet K is doing all this activity, which is what Dante was doing as well. You know,
Yes.
this idea that conceptual stuff is like new. You know, Dante's always breaking the, you know, the so-called fourth wall of the poem, always talking about himself, but also ascribing either certain grandiosity to the poet D or a certain sort of uncertainty that clearly didn't have, because, you know, because he's writing that thing, he's creating that uncertainty for us to experience alongside. So I mean, my poet K is in my translation is much, much sassier than Dante is in the various points, in part because I'm like, well, we gotta get on with this. Like, think, you know, a lot of time's passed, and also this is all mixed up in a really difficult way. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing is, I'll read you this little passage as an example, because then the audience can hear
Of course,
the
yeah.
the way that the paraphrasis works. So this is from the memoir from here in Volterra, but doesn't matter. So the only people's proper names are people who are dead, but I don't give people I don't like. So I don't name Mussolini, but you know he's in there. So the woman who speaks, you know, Mary, and then of course it allows me to then take things like the Agnus Dei and strip it out from religion, which becomes the ancient 3-line song, which I translate as to be vulnerable is to be valuable. So at Mass the next day, the people of the village speak to the woman who speaks at length, at the start, all throughout, and at the finish. They speak her list of names. The woman who speaks is dressed in the sun, crowned with stars, draped in blue. Jay, the partner of the poet K, Jay sings the ancient 3-line song. To be vulnerable is to be valuable. The key ingredients about which there are truths are assembled and require no belief. The cloth tightly woven, the bread, the wine, the song. Words and movements building heat toward necessary storms. The priest speaks about that week's words, the words about the great cloud, the storm, words about the son of the woman who speaks, opening books, thousands upon thousands who wait, words that say, listen. Words K would say mean death is a matter of a transformation of matter, of what matters. Words do this. Words change states. Words make things happen. Words make things happen always, or as long as a word like always can be made to last, which is forever. All this possible meaning drawn from words that, even when pressed into stone, onto air or paper or lambskin, slip away into the cave within a cave that holds the statue of the woman who speaks, as words should. If K needs a vision, needs meaning, she makes it happen here, with care, again, for the first time, forever. You read it here before it slips away. Changed. After Mass is ended, the priest announces K and J's presence. He thanks the voice of the ancient 3-line song, which is J. The priest says that with us today is a woman with roots so deep, deep as the caves carved out to make the houses where first the ancients lived, below where the animals were kept, where now the wine is stored. Threads woven so profoundly tight that she has come all the way here to this cathedral dedicated to the woman who speaks, to sit and imagine her ancestors doing the same. Kay imagines her ancestors imagining theirs. Everyone was everywhere at one time, and everyone was a small number then. And everyone is more now, with countless connections, invisible black and white threads wrapped around our hearts. So I very much am not trying to make an Italian exceptionalism or a kind of I'm working against that idea.
Of course.
And so that's the kind of that's the play on all the power of those things, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful snapshot there of you entering this kind of space, which is not just spiritual, is also historical for you, is genealogical. Your whole work kind of holds together this idea of mobility, of transition, of transmutation as well, but also stillness and fixity. There's quite a strong tension against fixity, against anything that can be a proper noun or that can be exclusively an I. And where I was going with that was Prideaux Angels 2018. Yeah, so
no, that's cool. That's good. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah,
because that's something quite different. Is is a children's book that you worked on with Simon Birch, choreographer.
Yeah.
So there's also this kind of intermediality, but what really hit me was the corporeality Birch comes from, and then your work that comes after, and your presence in the body, and your body's presence in your work, and kind of all of that weaving together again in quite surprising ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I was asked to write the script for that, and just the script initially, and I said sure. And so it's set in Prideaux Place in Padstow, where it was one of the places where they sent the children from big cities during the Second World War to avoid them being killed by bombs, and also to give them nutrition and things like that. And so it follows that idea, and the whole plot line that's very much Simon's, but is my shared affinity, is welcoming the stranger, which is this strange snowflake that's who meets pilots, like flying, across the channel and moving planes. And but I think for me, that writing that script, we started working on it, and I saw that Simon had made some illustrations to help the dancers. And I was like, we should just make a book of this, because they're really good. He's now really turned to art since. But I think that sense of embodiment is very much a part of the voicing of a poem or a voicing of any language that, and so that sense of the power of what you can do with words, which is my big thing, is not exclusive to literary folk. And I think that hierarchizing of that is still very prevalent, everywhere. Which doesn't really help us all that much, because then it's too easy to get taken in by things that are completely against what people actually think. That I say a lot in the memoir, novel, whatever, the sources that cannot be trusted with our graves, these sources end meals, which that's just Fox News, but it's any source that is cited in this way that leads you into this way of thinking that is actually the opposite of that, of the exact words that you're saying the rest of the time. To be vulnerable is to be valuable, So the idea of people using language in these different ways, and not perhaps thinking about it, is something that's always interests me. But I think when you're working in another language, as you are all the time, you're more aware of the gap, I suppose. I mean, do you feel that?
Absolutely.
Because you're thinking of more meaningful layers of meaning, perhaps more profound layers.
I think there's a ongoing, almost painful sometimes, research for the right word that sometimes doesn't translate, and there are words that just come in one language and they just don't come in another language, and the limitations of the language boundaries itself as well comes into play. And there's a lot of translating of not just language, of the emotional language that one has inside, that kind of breeds in forms and sounds that cannot really be written down, and it's just a feeling, it's just a sense of something, and there's a lot of that kind of translating, and I would say there's a lot of frustration in not finding the right words, in wanting to mix two different languages to make something that actually reflects somehow what one is feeling. But you did a workshop in Volturara about this.
I was trying to get people to do that in the workshop. Please use a sentence that combines several things. And they were like, we can't do that. You know, so it was really interesting to see that was, they were happy to work in dialect orally and then have somebody note it down. But it was difficult to say, well, why don't you just, because when they're speaking, they do it, but it doesn't translate into the written form, which I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
And so it did help when I said, you know, the church is not important in Elkhart, even though so many people came from here. They forgot about the church, but they would use it as an insult or as an affectionate term, you know. So there's also that thing of the way our words have morphed into something that's completely unrecognizable to people here, but they still function in the same way. And which ones we decided to keep. I suppose the transnational question, just to go to your theme, is that when you move around, it's obvious to say, but you notice things that you wouldn't otherwise notice. But you have to profoundly attempt and make yourself low. or somebody will make you low in many cases. If you're privileged, probably not. But, you know, I did ask some of the young people here one night, I said, so if people start coming here, you know, because I'm going to have people come and they're all going to love this place. I know they will. I said, what should the test be for them to be let in to like come? And they were like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, I'm not going to just let anybody in here, you know. And they were like, well, if they want to be here, that's probably enough because they'll have had to go through things like you have. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I was going through. But it's that thing of the level of the intensity of it, I think, is what, if I was to say about what's been going on simultaneously in the UK around, you know, these horrible far right, you know, violence and attacks on people, it's like that is literally happening at the same time. Like, meanwhile, this is what's, and the Great Meanwhile shows, and Gaza and all these sorts of things, like it's astonishing, the level of the gap, you know, between these things. And you know, I think I say at one point, I was trying to get through this bit of one of the translations. It's very complicated because Virgil is quoting Beatrice, who's then saying to Dante, you're a good dude, you know, so, but I'm just like, I have it myself, like a voice like mine is mine, you know, the woman above me looking down or up, it's her. Outrageous eyes, the stars can't beat them. So much less, you know, gazy, you know, say I am important and good. But then it gets down a bit, and it's like the singing my praises, releasing these phrases, voices dropping off, starting up again. I note that partial here replaces sheer annihilation. What breaks off such action in this minor universe, which is how Dante calls the whole thing? Statements, words. What allows it to keep up? Statements, words. She's sure of it. And that means me too. It's better to hear and say this rather than not at all. Better to get going, you know, on what. But then suddenly the responsibility becomes really different. And, you know, the point where he talks about the fence sitters and the people who won't commit. And so they're condemned to chase after the banners for the things that they wouldn't take a stand on. And boy, I was like translating that in this context and thinking, you know, where I'm trying to get people to talk about fascism. You know, I'm trying to get people to sort of, you know, to articulate some things that are really relevant right now that are, you know, for similarly to the UK, because it's the juxtaposition. I mean, it's literally, we can see Elon Musk saying a thing and making it so. That is words change states.
So since we're talking about words, the last thing I'm gonna ask you about words changing states. So in this, let's call it this minor universe of the meanwhile, what kind of words do we need?
I think we need to strip down to the most basic implements, which is what this has done, is strip it right down. Hunger, I say, I don't know it. Hunger, the beast, I have not known it. There is no analogous pain. Inexactitude, lack of detail. This is what it feeds. What feeds it? Hunger, a beast and a half, in the profoundest sense of the word. That our ancestors signed X and felt hunger, and we immediately forgot, makes us clutch and throw up statues to those who caused it for others. Too direct, too clear, too telling, too much. Dante created his guides in his own need to be told how to do it and why and where to go. Otherwise, we'd tired of all his preaching. Otherwise, hello, he's just fine. He's already knows. And so I think that's stripping back, because anybody can understand that as well. It's the basic words, the first words we learn, and then go from there.
We'll do our best to do that. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Kimberly. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.